Alright, so we're going to be moving on to section 3 right now, which is selecting random samples and looking at basically introing experiments and going after the topics of what, or the main things about what involves an experiment. So first off, we're going to talk about selecting our random samples. Okay, so if you're doing something as simple as a simple random sample, an SRS sample, what you can just say is, put everybody's name in a hat or give everybody a number and then pick them out one at a time. This is very easy. It can be time consuming if you're actually doing it, because you would have to go through every single one. Things you can write down if you're asked to explain a simple random sample: write down all the names on slips of paper, put those pieces of paper in a hat, and then pull them out one by one. You also want to mention if you're doing a replacement or without replacement. So once the name's been selected, are they put back in or are they kept out of the selection process after they've been picked? Okay, so that's super simple. It is just time consuming. You could also use computers to randomly generate numbers. Okay, so your calculator can basically randomly generate digits for you, and you can use those. This is with the TI-8384. What you do is you push math, you arrow over to where it says PRB along the top, and you go down to number 5. It's or rand int. It's saying random integers, and then when you type it in, if it doesn't come up with the one screen, you type in the lower, comma, upper, so your lower limit, your upper limit, so it's the smallest number and the largest number, and then n is how many do you want. You can use this as a way to do random generating, as long as you just explain that that's what you're doing. You can also just say, let a computer consume or generate the numbers. This allows you to do it in a lot shorter time because the computer is just randomly generating the numbers. But one thing you're going to need to mention is that every individual or every observation, whatever it is, needs to be numbered. Okay, and say what those number ranges are, from 001 up to 999 or whatever it might be. Okay. Your calculator, it can also do something called seeding. I'm just going to run through it real quick. Basically, you can set up your calculator so that every quote unquote random number is the same when you reset it. So if you seed it with the same number, then all your calculators, your 83, 84 calculators, use the same process to randomly generate these numbers. So if you give it the same starting point, they're going to generate the same numbers over and over again. Okay, this is just how you do it. It's not going to be that big of a deal. The only thing would be if you're asked to seed it ahead of time. AP exam won't do that. You ask to seed it a certain way so everybody gets the same quote unquote random numbers. Table of random digits you could use. So these are just random numbers in groups of 5, and they fill up an entire page. Basically, to use this table, once you've numbered your groups or your people, your individuals, whatever it is that you're taking the sample from, what you're going to do is you basically start at the beginning of one row at random, and you take however many digits that you are. So if you have numbers, let's say from 1 to 150, you're going to go 001 up to 150, and you would take groups of 3, and every group of 3 that actually falls into that range of numbers, you count. If they don't, then you remove it, or you just skip that set of numbers. Okay, you keep doing that until you got however many you want. So we're going to see an example of this on the next slide, I believe. Yep. So here would be an example of it. So newspaper is doing an article about places to stay for spring break in beach towns. So the editor randomly selects 4 hotels, and so to do that, they alphabetized the hotels. So you see the list of hotels there. So they alphabetized it, and then they gave them numbers. Since there's 28, they just went from 01 up to 28. Then they took a random number sheet, basically. They went to a certain starting line, which would be, in this case, 140. And then what they're doing is they're going to take groups of 2. And so if you want to describe how how the SRS was collected, basically you would just say that each hotel is given a 2-digit number starting the list. I will choose 2 digits at a time. If the number is between 0, 1, and 28, then it represents the hotel in the sample. If it's outside the range, or we've already selected it, there's your without replacement. We skip it and move on to the next 2 digits. You repeat this until until the 4 hotels are picked. That's basically how you would go about doing this. So if we look at this, so we start off with the first one, which is 1, 2. Well, we have digits 1, 2, which is at the Holiday Inn, so that would be our first one. The next one after that is 9, 7. We don't have a 97, so we skip those 2. Next one would be 5 and 1, so 51. Nope. 32. Nope. 58. Nope. 13 is the next one, so we go up to Lime Tree. Lime Tree would be our next one. After 13, we have 0, 4, which means we go over here to this one. And then we have 84, 51, 44. All of those are not in our range. 72 is not, 32 is not, and then 18 is our last one. And so this is what it would look like with the numbers. So the blue lines are showing the number go to which hotel, and the orange ones are crossed out because they aren't in our range. So because they're not in our range, we just move on to the next 2 after those. Okay, you don't repeat numbers. You don't go, oh, 97 doesn't work, I'm going to go 75. Oh, 75 doesn't work, I'm going to go on to the next one. That's not how this works. So our hotels that we pick would be those 4 hotels on our list. Okay. All right, so moving on to our next thing, we're going to be looking at experiments. So just brief, the difference between an experimental and an observational study. An observational study, which we've talked about, is when you observe individuals or measure them, but you don't attempt to change anything. So you're just gathering the information. This could be your retrospective ones where you look in the past, or perspective where you look at, what's your GPA now, and then did you graduate college? So you're looking more in the future. But you're not trying to influence their decisions in any way. You're trying to keep it very straightforward. An experiment, on the other hand, is where you actually change something. There's a treatment that's done. We've given them a medicine. Medicine is probably the most common example for an experiment, testing out different medicines. We had them do a workout before school. Did their grades improve? You had them do something different, or you manipulated them or changed them to see what the response was. And that's what an experiment is. So a couple terms that we have here. Experimental units. These are the things that are changed in the experiment. Okay, so is it, and it's what's being measured. So it could be, what's their grade, how are they feeling better, etc. Your subjects are basically what you're changing, and it's what we use for human beings in particular. So if they're humans, we say they're subjects. With the animals, we also say they're subjects. But if it's something that's more like a chair or just like an object, we just say experimental units. Next up after that is your treatment. This is specifically what condition has been changed that you're testing for. Okay, and what has been applied to these units. Okay. All right, so the next slide is going to have 4 examples of studies, and if you want, you can pause for a second and identify if the following is an experimental or an observational study, and explain why. So remember, an experimental study needs to have some sort of manipulation and change, while an observational study is just looking at data, essentially, and you're not changing anything. Okay, so if you want to pause for a second and identify what these are. All right, going through these one by one. So, first one, the medical team examines the record of 5 large hospitals and compares the survival times of those patients who had surgery versus those who had chemo. Would this be an observational or experimental? It would be observational. And the reason it's observational is because there's no change. There is no treatment that was imposed to them. It was just, this is what happened, and I'm taking that data. So it was a retrospective study. Okay, so there was no change. Yes, there was. They could either had surgery or chemo, but you weren't the one that basically were comparing that. You were looking afterwards. So that's why this would be an observational study. Next one, in a gym class, the effect of exercise on blood pressure is studied to by requiring half the students to walk a mile each day while the other half of them run a mile. That would be experiment. And it's an experiment because there is some sort of treatment, either walking or running, and then you're gauging a response, or you're seeing what the response is. So that's why this would be an experimental study. Number 3, the relationship between the weight of bears and the lengths and their lengths is studied by measuring bears that have been anesthetized. So this one is observational, and it's observational because you're not doing any treatment to the bears. You're just measuring them. This is how much they weigh. This is how long it is. There's no treatment involved. Last one, people who smoke are asked to have the number of cigarettes they consume each day so that any effect on the pulse rate can be measured. This would be experiment. It's an experiment because you're asking them to change their cigarette consumption. So you're asking them to change something in their daily life and then measure something else based off of that change. So that's an experiment. Okay. Okay, so the next 5, same thing. If you want, pause the video and you can look at this. So you're trying to identify, is it an observational or experimental study? Also, what is the explanatory and the response variables of these? Okay, so again, we're still identifying if it's observational or experimental, and then what the explanatory and response. Remember, the response variable, which is like your why, it's the one that changes based on something that has changed, which is the explanatory. The explanatory explains why the response variable is changing. Okay, so first one effect of alcohol is a drop in body temperature. To study the effect, researchers give several amounts of alcohol to mice and then measure the change in the mice's body temperature. So, experiment, what's the explanatory, what's the response? This is an experiment. It is an experiment because you're giving a treatment, alcohol in this case, to mice, and then you're seeing how their change in their body temp was. So the explanatory would be the amount of alcohol. So that's what's being treated to them. And then the response was, did their body temperature fall? Did their body temperature rise? That's your response. So you're trying to see, is alcohol the reason for the body temp change? Number 6, a study if done to try and find the correlation between a verbal and math SAT scores. Scientists want to use verbal score to predict the math score. Is this going to be observational or experiment? It is observational. There is no treatment in this one. It's just taking your verbal score and your math score and comparing them. So the scientist wants to use the verbal score to predict the math score. That means that your explanatory is going to be the verbal and your response is the math. They're trying to see, can the verbal predict what math is going to be? And that's what they're looking at. So that's why the verbal is the explanatory, while math is the response. Number 7, some breast cancer patients were given a new treatment. The patients were closely followed to see how long they lived following surgery. Is this observational or an experiment? It is an experiment. And the reason is because they they got different treatments, and then see how long. So with that, we have your explanatory is the treatment itself, pretty obvious here, and the response variable is how long they lived following the surgery. You could say surgery as the explanatory, but how long they lived afterwards. Okay. All right, last one. To find out how well a child's height predicts their age, a study is done to measure the heights of a group of children at age 6, waited until they were 16 and measure their heights again. This would be observational. Observational because you're not doing any treatment. You're just measuring heights at 6, measuring heights at 16. So the explanatory is the height, and then your response is the age. Okay, because they want to see if the height can predict the age. So that's why. All right, so what is the number one advantage of an experiment over an observational study? This is key. If it's well designed and it's controlled. Okay, so those are criteria that need to be met. You are able to use an experiment to find the cause of changing from one to another. So let's say we look at looking back a couple slides to the experiment with the alcohol in the mice. If you could show that the more alcohol you give, the lower the body temp, then you could say the alcohol is the cause of it. An observational study cannot do causation. Okay, it's just a correlation, which are different. So experiment shows as cause.